Everyone, good morning. My name is Quintin, and unfortunately, I didn't understand the prayer. I'm Cheyenne. I should understand the prayer. I understood a few words, but unfortunately, most of our Cheyenne nation is like me. They're not fluent. Even though I'm full-blooded Cheyenne, both parents spoke Cheyenne as their first language and so forth. So I mentioned that because the relevancy of public education to Native students. What is relevant in public education? I'll talk about that later. But I want to welcome you and thank you on behalf of NIEA, National Indian Education Association, the oldest national education organization that represents Indian education in the United States. On behalf of 11 other board members and Executive Director Colin Kippen and Don here is one of the staff members and the other staff members on the NIEA. Thank you for this opportunity. This is a really important topic. I mean, I have to tell you some personal experiences. Why it's so important. I was raised in public school in Northwest Oklahoma, probably about 25-30% Native American. And you have to kind of step back and consider what's going on. It was Northwest Oklahoma, 4 million acres was Cheyenne Arapaho land, by treaty. Actually, if you want to go back to treaties, we actually own most of eastern Colorado and part of Kansas by treaty before they discovered gold. But jump forward, and we're in Oklahoma now with 3 or 4 million acres. And the Allotment Act came, and then they took us off the reservation and gave us 160 acres and, said you're going to make good farmers. Unfortunately, there's very few farmers in the Indian country today. But think about that. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, was not known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs there, but they were charged with education, and they sent students to public school. I actually have a story regarding, public school. My great-grandfather was part of that initial movement to the BI system. But I'm not going to talk about that today. In 1924, they made us citizens so we could go to public school. And there in Oklahoma, I went to school in the late 50s, and, you start noticing things. And, when I went, there was 12 other Native Americans, like myself. And you start asking yourself these questions, how come, there's a lot of us at the start, but at the end, there's not too many. I mean, unfortunately, those 12 students in the first grade, I have to say they were, some of them a lot smarter than I was, certainly better athletes than I was. A lot of them better communicators than I were. Some of them came from better families as far as having a mother and father. I was raised in a one-parent home. So different issues, but why is it that, I'm the only one that graduated in 1970? But and I say that because, I would ask the questions, when did the Indians graduate? Well, it wasn't until late 1940s, 1948, that the first Cheyenne Arapaho graduated from Watauga Public School. Now, I don't know how many of our students actually went to public school and how many actually went to BIA. All of my older siblings, they all went to BIA. But, that's where I had, and I went through Watauga High School 12 years public school, and I went to the local university, spent 2 years in the military, came back, and, I didn't choose education, as a career field. I started working for the tribe, and then politics got me, so then I went to the, shipping industry, worked for a Trump company, and then the downturn of the oil industry, the 70s, we lost the jobs. I went back. My mother said, hey, the Indian counselor job is there. Come back and work. And I said, okay, I'll go until I find something better. Well, 16 years later, I was still there. But I enjoyed it, not only getting a chance to see my kids graduate, but, I got to see the inside of, the inner workings of public school. Did some, data results, surveys, and, would show that we had a 60% success rate for Native Americans in our school. And I really thought that was bad. I thought, man, this is bad. This is terrible. I had 5 kids, and that's like me saying I'm going to go to this school, but I know only 3 of them are going to graduate. you know. But, apparently that was better than the average because it's 1 out of every 2. So, if you have 2 kids and you're going to go to this particular school, public school, any public school, 1 out of 2 chances, one of them's, not going to finish school. Now, I can say that here, and none of us, that's going to apply to any of us because we're all education-minded and we're all pro-education. We all want the best for our kids. We sacrifice and so forth. But a lot of our parents can't do that. So the ones that statistic that, should be really appalled at it, they're not listening. They're not here to hear that statement. But we are here. We're the decision makers, policy makers, and hopefully tribal leaders that can affect the situation. But that is appalling. Cheyenne Arapaho tribes. I'm a citizen of Cheyenne Arapaho tribes. I'm only Cheyenne. I'm not Arapaho, but I'm a citizen. And we would get a social services. Another term you may be familiar with, Indian welfare. BIA has social services, general assistance. The tribe got some more money, and then they actually supplemented that fund. But still today, we have a lot of people still subsiding on that, and you can guarantee to look at their background, they don't have the education background that is needed. That's why they're stuck in that situation. They rely upon the government. I always remember that commercial. I'm not a golfer. I think it was Arnold Palmer was advertising Pennzoil. Anybody remember that? Anybody remember that? Pay me now or pay me later. Pay me now or pay me later. So, what that meant to me is that, unless you invest in our kids now, rest of us are going to be paying for it. Mentioned earlier about the statistics, what's going to happen. But, it's even worse where I'm from. If you don't graduate from high school, it's almost a guarantee of a terrible life. I mean, undereducated, relationship, drug abuse, you just name it. I mean, I can't tell you how many of those 12 aren't even alive today. Just very few of us are alive. And some of them weren't even alive 10 years out of high school. So I can tell you it's a guarantee of a terrible, terrible bad life. And I'm sure it's like that in other situations. I'm sure it's better in some situations. But the data is out there, and I wanted to speak about a few things about NIEA, but and I'm probably going to miss some of these policy things that I need to tell you about. But there's a lot of happening in education, and a lot of it applies to Indian education. NIEA, we do our best. We have an annual convention, which this year is going to be Oklahoma City, October 18th to 21st. But we actually were here several years ago in Phoenix. But we do our best to represent Indian country. But it's getting to be a bigger, monster here. You got to, be a jack of all trades. You can't just confine yourself to Title VII or Johnson O'Malley. You got to know the big picture. Other departments, other funding agencies, and how that affects. So it's a learning experience. NIEA. And we do our best to promote our issues at a national level. And so critical now because of the reauthorization of ESEA and NCLB. The good news is that the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, they passed a bill out of their committee, and it's Senate Bill 1262. It's called the Native Class Act. Out of many of our Indian education recommendations, which was developed by input by TEDNA, Tribal Education Department's National Organization, National Assembly, NCAI, National Congress of American Indians, USET, United Southern and Eastern Tribes. We put together some language. We submitted it to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and most of it, a lot of it, was included in this Native Class Act. Well, what happened is, probably I'm not going to tell you the story. The following speaker, Bill, will probably tell you the story, what's happening in Washington, D.C. But ESEA is not going to be reauthorized, but it's sitting out there with our recommendations. And so we're promoting that. And I'm just going to talk about a few things that are there. We're asking that, states be held accountable for their native populations. We put out a letter just about a month ago is dealing with the the reauthorization of NCLB. If it doesn't happen, then states are having to or consider applying for the flexibility waiver. We put out a letter saying, well, that's great that states are doing it, but in your application, Department of Education, it says you're to consult with native tribes. And we looked at some of the applications that were put forth, and very few of them were consulting directly with native tribes. They would go to maybe a regional tribal meeting and give the information out there. In Oklahoma, we looked at the application and said they consulted with the intertribal group, and we were joking among ourselves, sounded like some powwow, drum group, and there was not a tribe, even though it was 38 tribes. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know how they consulted with them or not. But that's, you have to look at that in every state. I'm not sure how. I didn't look at the application, if there is an application for Arizona, but it came out as a result of complaints or concerns from New Mexico tribes saying they were left out of the application procedure. And so, that in line with the President's consultation, policy, it was kind of a little bit out of whack. Happened so fast. A lot of information was gathered. These applications are thick. But also to step back, tribes, they need to step forward too. They need to develop their tribal education departments. Even if they were given the opportunity to give input, I'm not sure how many tribes would actually have the capacity or the resources to give input into that. And one of the reasons they can is because, if you're a tribal member, we can name off the reasons. But what needs to happen for tribes is they need to develop their capacity to be ball players, so to speak. And I'm going to use this language. If you play sports, we need to get in the game. We need to get in the game of education. Unfortunately, when I started for Watonga School, statistics haven't gotten any better, and I looked at some of the NCES materials. They're not projecting it's going to be any better for Native American students in the future. So, tribes need to get in the ballgame. They need to develop their capacity, and they can't do it just by themselves. Tribal leaders need to step forward. It's interesting. I hear the comments that about things that are happening good in education, and there's a lot of good things happening nationwide in public schools. A lot of good partnerships, are happening. The Native community comes forth with the public school community, and a lot of good things can happen. In education, they call it best practices, those type of things. And I'm all for best practices. There's great ones. But, and I can't remember names, but remember there was a history lesson about, Plymouth Rock when the Pilgrims came and they had such a hard time, and the tribe there helped them out, and they had the Thanksgiving dinner and everything was fine. But what happened? They came to understand and respect each other back then. And the leaders of the Pilgrim community and the local tribe, they probably had a really good relationship. But you know what? They got old and they passed away. The younger generation, they came about and had other needs. And, then it didn't turn out so well. It didn't turn out so well for us. And it continues to be like that. We have a lot of good relationships. Public schools officials, they sit down and meet with tribes and the Indian community, come out with these great plans and do things, but unfortunately they move on. And so that's why it's so important that we have new initiatives like the STEP program, the State Tribal Education Partnership Program, also known as the TEA pilot. TEA is Tribal Education Agency. If you know with the SEA, LEA, then TEA is the same capacity that right now the TEA pilot was included in the Native Class Act, but through this administration, and I'm probably taking some of the Bill's information from you right here, but he's always got something new when I listen to him. So, but the TEA pilot, I think it is groundbreaking. It is time to allow these tribes to get in the ballgame as far as public education is concerned. And the concept, and let me tell you, it's not an AIM movement. If you're old enough to remember AIM, they say AIM's going to come, they're going to take over, they're going to take over the tribal complex. It's not like that. But even though I've heard those terms, TEA, the tribes are going to take over public school. That's further from the case. I mentioned this flexibility waiver process. Even if they were able to sit down with tribes very few of them would have the capacity to actually give meaningful input in how to change that to the benefit of Native tribes. But the STEP program, what's going to happen in this pilot program is going to, allow up to 5 tribes to work with their SEAs in their particular states. So it's so important. I'm hoping, maybe someone from Arizona, some tribe will step forth and say, hey, let's, see how this works and see how we can get it to work. The concept is that they would identify a title federal program, and they would work with the state through a MOU and say, let's see how we can work together to make this better for the LEA. Doesn't mean reduction of funds for the LEA. It just means that you'll have meaningful tribal input. And let me tell you, consultation's great. How many here have been to a BIA consultation? Anybody? A few of you? The ones I've been to, it's well, this is how we're going to do it for you. I just want you to know. That's basically the way it's gone for the BIA. We've already got this plan out here. We're just coming to tell you how we're going to do it. And that, unfortunately, that's not good consultation. So for tribes to sit down at the table and have input into how these federal programs are operated at a LEA level, I think it's meaningful. Now, how it's going to work, I think there's going to be a lot of kinks to be worked out, but it's not going to, it's not going to happen overnight unless people see the value of it. Now, how many tribes are actually ready to do that? 560? I would say probably in the nation, probably 20 or less are even ready to consider that. And what would that mean is that these tribes that are selected or that's successful, I'm hoping that it would motivate other tribes and say, hey, look what they're doing. Look at the success they're having in public school. Why don't our tribe step out and develop our tribe's education department so that we can compete, we can be resourced to the SEA, to the LEA at a meaningful level. So it's groundbreaking. I think we're going to wait and see what happens. But my little example from Oklahoma, as a student, as a parent, as an employee of the public school, there's 2 consultations they would have. One of them was a Title 4, 5, 7 Indian education hearing, and then the other was the Impact 8 hearing. And unfortunately, it got to be nobody came. Nobody came because parents would come to the meetings and they would listen and say, well, this is really what parents would say, this is what I think needs to happen. And the administration would say, well, thank you for coming. That's a good idea. Then they would go back and hire the coach's wife for secretary with the funds. I mean, it's humorous, but unfortunately that's happened quite a bit in where I come from. And so, the STEP program is, putting tribes on an equal level if they're ready to be there. If they're not, then, don't apply. It's not money. It's not a grant program. It's the future of our kids. I'm going to stop right there about the TEA program, and I'm hoping Bill will talk more about that. But I wanted to close with a few thoughts here. Well, before I do, let me talk about some of the policy issues. By the way, on NIEA.org, you can go to our website, and you can look at some of the click on the policy statements. We have our resolutions from past conventions. We have our briefing papers, and also we have position papers out there. So go to our website and download them and read them if it applies to you. We're putting forth our appropriations letter on the budget process. We're also going to do comments into the BIE reorganization plan. We're going to have input on the MOU and the executive order at some point in here in the future. We're also pushing for the reauthorization of the Esther Martinez bill, which is a very, very impactful bill. And so there's other things that are happening. We have a committee within the NIEA organization. It's called our legislative committee. Actually, they must have started this. This is my second term. It was 93, 94, I came on the first 3-year term. They just had started the legislative committee, and I can understand why, because so many things are happening to keep up with all these issues. Later on, the speaker, Denise Gino, is going to come up here and talk to you, but her mother, Carol, is on our committee, and she's actually chair of the legislative committee. So she's actually the one I talk to the most because of all the things going on. with legislation. So it's very important. So we're doing our best. But I wanted to close with these few comments. You know, tribes, you know, I think they're key to this, one of the key components of how we resolve this situation. You know, tribes have tribal members. You know, they're tribal members regardless of where they're at. Someone who's attending public school in Arizona, once he goes across that border to New Mexico, he's no longer their concern. It's New Mexico's concern. But if they happen to be Navajo, they go across that border, they're still Navajo citizen. So they still take care of them. So tribes are like that all over. So some of the tribes are taking responsibility for their students, and they have to. I mean, they have to stop this, you know, pay me now, pay me later, you know, situation. And they have to take control. They have to become partners with local and state entities, LEAs and SEAs. They have to be meaningful partners. But it's important that we also have the data. You know, I would ask a group of tribal leaders, I said, you know, you can quote probably your dropout rate in your state, probably at your local school, but can you give me your dropout rate for your tribe? And very few of them could even answer me. I don't think any of them ever gave me, unless they were just one of these 10, 12-member tribes, you know, they could, you know, give me that data. But if you're the Navajo Nation, I'm not even sure that they could, because their members are spread out so many different states. And so, yeah, that's information that we need to know where we're at. You know, how many of our members are actually graduating, you know, on time. And even more so, you know, how many of them are actually, you know, at reading level at a particular point in their careers. You know, what is the third grade reading level? What is their math scores? You know, what are they having issues with? Even more important, you know, grow your own. We're talking, you know, I was going to mention about grow your own for teachers. It's so important. That's one of the issues we're promoting. Now, how are we going to know if they're even interested in becoming a teacher? How we are going to even know if they want to be a doctor, a lawyer, or maybe a future tribal leader, if they're even considering that at an early age, 6th or 7th grade. Tribes, BIA, they have the database right now. They keep enrollment data. They keep it right now. So we would complement that with partnerships. I think we could start grow your own programs that would help resolve this situation. You know, we have reservation schools. Where I was at, you would have students would say, "Oh, I'm going to the, you know, BIA school, and you know, I'm checking out." So they would leave, and pretty soon they say, "Hey, you know, Tom's back in town." I go see Tom and said, "Tom, you back, huh? How long you been back?" "Oh, about 4 or 5 weeks." You know, if you're an educator, you know what that means. I mean, so. You know, this information, this data that's needed by tribes, the sharing of data by states, by LEAs, you know, the relationship is not a diversity cultural issue. It's a government-to-government issue. You know, if you don't believe that, you go back and look at all the treaties that Indian tribes have in the United States government. So we need to have access to our data. We need that information, not just to say we have the information, we need to know where we're at. We need to know where we're going. So, you know, that's really important. I'm hoping that we can resolve that. This Cradle to Career initiative that's mentioned in the executive order, it's so key, so vital. I heard the term silos. You know, we have silos all over the place for our Indian students. We have silos at high school. You know, how much do they actually get, you know, career counseling, going to college, post-secondary education? You know, it varies, but then they go to college, and that's a different silo. They don't talk to each other. They may participate in a summer program, an upper bound program. It's a different silo. Then you got the tribal higher ed program. It's a different silo over here. Did you know that the National Indian Education Study, the last 3 ones that were held for students in 8th grade, almost 80% of them in 8th grade said they were going to go on to post-secondary education? Now, how many of those actually graduated? According to statistics, only half of those students graduated. So what's happening from the 8th grade until they graduate? We don't know. We don't have the data. We'd like to know who they are. We'd like to get them information. We'd like to, you know, work with them. We'd like to, you know, direct them to summer programs. Someone, am I getting close? I'm getting close. I better wrap it up here. One final point here. A lot of these workshops and these meetings, conferences we go to, we always talk about what's going on inside the classroom, what's going on inside the school. Well, for me personally, and this is Quintin Romano's opinion, it's not NIEA, TEDNA, or anybody else, Indian education, it is not just in the classroom. It's not just pre-K to 12 or pre-K to 16. It's actually from birth until death. It's actually 24/7. It's from the time you get up until the time you go to sleep. That's the traditions of our Indian nations. Now, what does that mean to us today? Well, to solve this riddle, we need to look at what's going on outside the classroom. Every one of us that succeeded here in education, you look back at your career, we had an influential person or persons, or maybe a program or event or something in our lives that happened outside the classroom. We need to know what's going on there. And I think tribes have the capacity to help that. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm waiting to hear Bill. He always has really good information. Thank you.